early 14th century, England trembled under the uneasy reign of King Edward II, a monarch torn between royal duty and private affection. His rule, born in the long shadow of his father's iron hand, promised stability but delivered turmoil. The land was weary from war, the coffers drained, the nobility restless. Yet amid the crumbling order, one figure stood closer to the king than any noble, general, or priest: Piers Gaveston, the charming Gascon whose presence at court would ignite resentment that burned for years. At Edward's coronation, whispers already filled Westminster. The barons saw the new king's favor toward his beloved companion as a betrayal of the realm's dignity. To them, Gaveston's influence was poison, his arrogance a spark ready to set England ablaze. But Edward was blind to the danger. He called Gaveston "my brother, my heart," and showered him with titles: Earl of Cornwall, Lord of the Royal Wardrobe. For the first time, the English crown seemed less a symbol of sovereignty than a token of devotion. Soon power began to fracture. The great families, Lancaster, Warwick, Hereford, joined in secret pacts. The people murmured that their king was bewitched, enslaved by friendship-turned-obsession. Yet Edward refused to bend. He saw in Gaveston the only soul who understood his loneliness, the one man who made him feel human in a world of crowns and swords. But politics has no patience for affection. When famine struck in 1315 and the Scots raided deep into the north, the nobles demanded action. They forced the king to exile Gaveston once more. The royal favorite fled across the Channel, leaving behind a court divided and a king unmoored. For months, Edward ruled in silence, signing decrees without conviction, attending councils without speaking. Chroniclers later wrote, "The king's heart was gone with the earl." When Gaveston dared return to England, the inevitable tragedy unfolded. Captured by his enemies near Warwick, he was dragged to Blacklow Hill and executed without trial. The king wept publicly, defying the customs of royal restraint. England saw its monarch not as a lion, but as a grieving man, weak, emotional, unfit for the iron age of lords and rebellion. Yet from that grief was born something darker. Edward's sorrow hardened into bitterness, and his trust in the nobility withered. He began to seek allies not among the ancient houses, but among men who owed everything to him. Loyalists without lineage, ambitious enough to serve and sin alike. In this void of loyalty and love, the next figure would rise: Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man of cunning charm and ruthless ambition. As the bells of Westminster fade into the wind, the narration lowers to a whisper. Love had broken the king's heart once. Ambition would soon consume what remained. Fade to black. In the hollow left by Gaveston's death, a new presence crept into the king's heart: Hugh Despenser the Younger. Unlike Gaveston, Despenser was no playful courtier. He was a calculating noble, descended from one of England's oldest families, but driven by a hunger far beyond his station. Where Gaveston had captivated Edward with laughter and loyalty, Despenser ensnared him through ambition. He did not seek to entertain the king, he sought to rule through him. By 1320, Despenser's influence was unmistakable. He monopolized royal grants, seized lands, and extended his control through fear and favor alike. His father, Hugh the Elder, a hardened veteran of Edward I's campaigns, became his ally in power. Together, they transformed the royal household into a fortress of greed. The Despensers controlled the treasury, the courts, even the royal seal. To defy them was to defy the crown itself. But the English nobility had not forgotten. Thomas of Lancaster, the most powerful earl in England and cousin to the king, gathered his allies. The barons accused the Despensers of tyranny and corruption, of manipulating Edward into a puppet king. They demanded exile once again, this time not of a beloved friend, but of a hated usurper. Under immense pressure, Edward was forced to banish both Hugh the Younger and his father. Yet the exile was a farce. Within months, Despenser returned by sea, his ships raiding the Welsh coast with royal sanction. The king had chosen his side. When Lancaster rebelled, he did so under the banner of reform, claiming to restore England to rightful rule. But Despenser and Edward moved swiftly. In March 1322, at Boroughbridge, Lancaster's forces were crushed. The Earl was captured and executed, beheaded in public as a traitor. The sound of the axe marked the death of opposition in England. Now, with his enemies silenced, Edward's vengeance began. Lands were confiscated, families stripped of title and wealth. The Despensers became the new lords of England, their hands in every coin and every judgment. Chroniclers wrote that no man could rise or fall without their consent. But power is a fragile flame. The very cruelty that secured their dominance began to sow the seeds of ruin. The people suffered under heavy taxes. Lords who once knelt now plotted revenge in secret. And amid the growing dread, one figure watched in silence: Queen Isabella, the French wife of Edward II. Once a symbol of unity between two kingdoms, she now found herself isolated, humiliated, and despised by Despenser's faction. Despensers had not only conquered England's politics, they had conquered the king's soul. And in doing so, they made a fatal mistake. They turned the queen into an enemy. The screen fades to Isabella's cold stare, candlelight glinting in her eyes. Power built on fear, the narrator murmurs, is only waiting to be betrayed.
Once, Isabella of France had been called the she-wolf of England, only in whispers. Now, the title would become prophecy. Daughter of a French king and wife of an English one, she was born to mediate between empires, but in Edward's court, she became little more than a hostage. The Despensers stripped her of power, seized her dower lands, and placed spies among her attendants. Even her letters to France were intercepted. For years, she endured the humiliation in silence. Chroniclers described her as serene, even dutiful. But behind the quiet gaze was calculation. Isabella watched the Despensers' arrogance grow, the king's cruelty deepen, and England itself sink into despair. Famine stalked the villages, war drained the treasury, rebellion flared like embers beneath ash. The queen understood what the barons did not. Edward's downfall would not come through open battle. It would come through betrayal. In 1325, Edward sent Isabella to France under the pretext of diplomacy to negotiate peace with her brother, King Charles IV. It was a decision that would seal his fate. For once beyond Despenser's reach, Isabella refused to return. She spoke publicly of her husband's captivity under wicked counsel, accusing the Despensers of corruption and tyranny. England's exiles and enemies began to rally around her. Among them was Roger Mortimer, a former lord who had escaped the Tower of London and fled to France. Tall, cunning, and hardened by imprisonment, Mortimer saw in Isabella not only vengeance, but destiny. Their alliance, part political, part personal, became the core of a rebellion that would soon shake the realm. In secret, they raised an army. Isabella promised freedom from Despenser's tyranny. Mortimer promised justice for the fallen lords. From Hainault they secured ships and soldiers, and by autumn of 1326, sails appeared on the English horizon. The queen had returned, not as a diplomat, but as an avenger. Edward's support collapsed with astonishing speed. The nobles, long oppressed, now defected to Isabella's cause. Cities opened their gates without resistance. Despenser the Elder was captured and executed at Bristol. The younger tried to flee with the king toward Wales, but the tide of rebellion was unstoppable. As winter settled, the once mighty Edward found himself a fugitive in his own kingdom. The man who had ruled with arrogance and cruelty now cowered in monasteries begging for sanctuary. Yet the wheel of fate, long turning, had come full circle. The hunted king and his despised favorite were at last in the queen's grasp. Thunder echoes as the camera pans over the stormy Welsh coast. Vengeance, the narrator intones, moves not with rage, but with purpose. Cut to black. In the winter of 1326, the world of Edward II collapsed. Betrayed, deserted, and exhausted, the king and his beloved Hugh Despenser the Younger fled westward in desperation, their small retinue shrinking with each passing day. Cold, hungry, and hunted, they sought refuge among the marshlands near Neath Abbey. But there was no escape. The Queen's banners, blue and gold, appeared on the horizon like judgment itself. Edward was taken without a fight. The chroniclers say he trembled as he surrendered, not from fear, but from disbelief. Once, he had commanded armies and crushed rebellions. Now, he was little more than a prisoner, his reign reduced to silence and mud. Beside him stood Despenser, pale and broken, the architect of his own doom. Isabella and Mortimer entered Bristol as conquerors. The people lined the streets to cheer their liberation. But triumph quickly turned to vengeance. Despenser the Elder was dragged before the mob and hanged, his body torn apart. Days later, the Younger was brought before the Queen. He was accused of treason, heresy, and unspeakable cruelty. The sentence was death by the most brutal means. On a cold November morning, Despenser was taken to Hereford. A scaffold rose high above the crowd, banners snapping in the wind. He was stripped, crowned mockingly with thorns, and forced to watch as his crimes were proclaimed aloud. Then, before thousands, the executioner began his work. Chroniclers record every detail: the cutting, the fire, the silence that followed. To Isabella's followers, it was justice. To history, it was horror. Edward watched from afar, his mind unraveling. Within weeks, the once mighty king was forced to abdicate. Before Parliament, he handed the crown to his son, Edward of Windsor, soon to be Edward III, a boy of 14, silent and pale as the crown passed from trembling hands. The chamber held its breath as the former king whispered, "God save the new king." It was the first forced abdication in English history. The Lords called it peace restored. The people called it divine punishment. But beneath the solemn ceremony, a darker truth lingered. Power had merely changed hands, not its nature. Mortimer and Isabella ruled as regents, but their authority was born of rebellion and blood. The shadow that had haunted Edward now clung to them. The camera lingers on the barred window of a dark cell, a single candle flickering against the cold. A crown, the narrator says, is never truly surrendered. It is only taken. Months had passed since Edward's abdication. The former king, stripped of title and dignity, lingered in confinement, watched by guards loyal not to him, but to his enemies. Berkeley Castle was no prison of iron, it was a tomb of stone and silence. Letters from the time speak of the stench of decay, of screams carried by the wind. They keep him among rotting carcasses, one chronicler wrote, that the air itself may destroy him. Yet Edward did not die. He endured, gaunt, hollow-eyed, but alive. To Isabella and Mortimer, that endurance was dangerous. The longer he lived, the more England whispered. Some called for mercy, others for restoration. But the queen and her lover had seized the crown through rebellion. They could not allow the old king to exist, even in chains. His death became inevitable. Not a public execution, but a secret act meant to erase him from history. On the night of 21 September 1327, the silence of Berkeley was broken. The guards entered Edward's chamber under the guise of routine inspection. What followed remains one of medieval England's most chilling mysteries. Some accounts claim he was smothered beneath heavy blankets. Others tell of darker methods, cruel devices meant to leave no visible mark. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Before dawn, Edward of Carnarvon, once King of England, was dead. When the news reached court, Isabella wept publicly, claiming sorrow and innocence. Yet even her tears could not quiet the rumors. The chronicler, Geoffrey Le Baker, wrote that men whispered in every hall that the king was murdered by command. Whether out of guilt or calculation, Isabella ordered Edward's body displayed with honor. A royal funeral was held at Gloucester Abbey, the tomb carved with Latin words of peace. But those who attended spoke of unease. The coffin was sealed. No one was allowed to look inside. Still, the legend would not rest. In the years that followed, stories spread that Edward had survived, that a double had been buried in his place, that he had escaped to the continent and lived as a hermit in Italy. A monk of Sesima even claimed to have confessed a dying king named Edward of England. Historians debate the truth to this day, torn between record and rumor. But in the end, truth mattered less than legacy. Edward's reign had begun in love and ended in fire. His tragedy was not merely in death, but in the betrayal that surrounded it. Those who had destroyed him, Isabella and Mortimer, soon found the same fate waiting in the shadows. The camera drifts over Edward's tomb, candles guttering in the dark, as a somber choir hums beneath the narration. The sins that crown a king return to crown his killers. Fade to black. In the winter of 1327, Queen Isabella ruled England in the name of her young son, King Edward III. By her side stood Roger Mortimer, her lover and partner in rebellion, the man who had turned vengeance into power. Together, they governed from the shadows, two rulers behind a boy king too young to resist. For a time, the realm was quiet. The nobles who had helped them overthrow Hugh Despencer and the old king were rewarded with lands and titles. The people celebrated peace. But peace under tyranny is only silence before the storm. Mortimer, intoxicated by success, began to rule as if he were king himself. He surrounded himself with soldiers, demanded gold from the treasury, and treated petitions as insults. Even his allies began to whisper that he had replaced one tyrant with another. The same arrogance that had destroyed Despencer now took root in Mortimer's heart. Isabella, once hailed as the savior of England, found her name darkened by rumor. Chroniclers accused her of greed and lust, of ruling through passion rather than justice. The people who had once called her the she-wolf of France began to mean it not as admiration, but as fear. The queen's court glittered with luxury, while peasants starved and veterans of the rebellion went unpaid. Meanwhile, young Edward III, barely 15, began to understand the truth of his own captivity. Though crowned king, he could not command his army, choose his advisors, or even leave the palace without Mortimer's consent. The boy who had been used as a symbol of legitimacy was growing into a man, and into resentment. Whispers turned into plots. Loyal knights, men who had once served his father, began to visit the young king in secret. Among them was William Montague, a cunning soldier who saw the winds shifting. "Your crown," he told Edward, "is worn by another's hand." The boy listened, his anger hardening into resolve. On October 30th, 1330, the moment came. Mortimer and Isabella had gathered their court at Nottingham Castle, believing themselves untouchable. They dined late into the night, surrounded by guards. Outside the walls, under the cover of rain, the young king's conspirators moved silently through a hidden passage, the so-called tunnel of the guardroom. At midnight, they burst into the queen's chamber. Torches flared, swords clashed, and Mortimer's men fell in confusion. The queen screamed for mercy, but it was too late. Mortimer was seized before her eyes, still dressed in his nightclothes. "Fair son," Isabella cried, "have pity on the gentle Mortimer." But Edward's reply was cold and final. "You shall have justice, madam, not pity." Mortimer was dragged away, tried for treason, and condemned without hesitation. On 29 November 1330, the man who had helped kill a king was himself hanged at Tyburn. His body was left to rot in chains for days, a grim echo of Hugh Despenser's fate. Isabella was spared execution, but her power was shattered. She was confined to Castle Rising, living out her remaining years surrounded by silence and prayer. Some say she went mad. Others claim she died at peace, her rooms filled with the scent of burning candles and old regret. Thus ended the reign of the queen who had unmade a king. The wheel of vengeance had turned once more, grinding every name beneath it. In the chronicles of history, Isabella and Mortimer became warnings, symbols of how ambition can devour even those who wield it with purpose. The camera lingers on a cold crown resting on a stone altar, the echo of distant church bells fading into the dark. Power, the narrator whispers, never dies. It only changes hands.
When the fires of rebellion cooled and the graves were filled, England found itself changed forever. The story of Hugh Despenser, Edward II, Isabella, and Mortimer was not just a sequence of betrayals and deaths. It was a mirror held up to human nature itself. Hugh Despenser's rise had revealed the dangers of proximity to power. His fall, the savagery of vengeance cloaked as justice. Edward II's weakness had exposed how affection could warp governance. Isabella's rebellion had proven that righteousness, once mixed with ambition, could become indistinguishable from tyranny. And Mortimer's fate showed that even the boldest usurper cannot rule forever from the shadows. Yet amid this cycle of cruelty and revenge, a new England began to stir. The young Edward III, tempered by the chaos of his parents' sins, learned to rule with both strength and distance. He restored the dignity of the crown, built armies that would one day thunder across France, and turned England into a force Europe could not ignore. But even as his banners rose, the memory of the Despenser's screams and Mortimer's hanging lingered like ghosts in the royal halls. The punishment of Hugh Despenser became more than legend. It became law. For centuries, traitors in England would face the same ritual torment, hanged, drawn, and quartered, each stage echoing the vengeance first perfected in Hereford.
What had begun as political theater became legal precedent, embedding cruelty into the structure of English justice. It was a warning written not on parchment, but on flesh. Medieval chroniclers described these events with fascination and dread. They saw divine retribution in every twist of fate, every betrayal repaid. But to modernize, the story is less about God's justice and more about human obsession with control. Power in medieval England was not a possession. It was a contagion. Those who touched it too deeply were consumed, and those who tried to destroy it became infected themselves. Isabella's final years at Castle Rising were marked by strange habits. Servants spoke of her sitting alone in candlelight, whispering prayers in French, clutching a silver locket said to contain a fragment of her late husband's hair. Whether from guilt or longing, no one knew. She was buried in Greyfriars Church, her body wrapped in a nun's robe, the crown she had once worn placed quietly beside her. Few mourned, fewer remembered. As centuries passed, chroniclers softened her image, romanticized her defiance, and cast her as a tragic heroine rather than a calculating rebel. But the truth, like the execution scaffold at Hereford, remains soaked in ambiguity. No one in this story was innocent, only human. Perhaps that is why it endures. The rise and fall of Hugh Despenser the Younger is not merely a tale of medieval politics, but a timeless warning about the seduction of power and the fragility of restraint. Every age finds its own Despensers and Isabellas, its own rulers who mistake desire for destiny. The camera pans across mist-shrouded ruins, the distant toll of bells fading into the wind. History, the narrator whispers, is not written by the victors. It is written by the survivors, those who live long enough to regret what they have done. As the screen darkens, a single candle flickers out, its smoke curling upward like a departing soul. Fade to black. End. Edward III was barely 14 when the world of betrayal, murder, and ambition collapsed around him. The ghosts of his father, of Hugh Despenser, and of Mortimer whispered through every corridor of Windsor. He had been raised amid fear, taught by example that power was a poison, yet now it rested in his trembling hands. In the winter of 1330, England seemed quiet, but it was the silence of exhaustion. The court still belonged to Roger Mortimer, who ruled in the name of the young king. Queen Isabella, radiant and cunning, sat beside him as regent. They were lovers still, though rumor said their passion had cooled into mutual dependence and paranoia. Every decision of state bore Mortimer's seal, not the king's. Taxes rose, old enemies were imprisoned or executed, and those who whispered dissent were silenced in the dark. But Edward was not the boy they thought he was. Behind his courteous smiles, he studied his captors. He read the old records of kings, of Edward I, of Henry III, and asked quiet questions to his tutors. What makes a ruler strong? They gave cautious answers. One old knight, who had served his father in youth, answered with a trembling voice, "Strength, my liege, comes from fear, but it must never begin there." Edward remembered that. At night he dreamed of the scaffold at Hereford, of Hugh Despenser's screams, of his father's weeping, of his mother's cold stare. The visions fused into something like resolve. He would not die as they had. He would not rule as they had. The opportunity came that October.
Mortimer, swollen with arrogance, had summoned nobles to Nottingham Castle to tighten his grip on the realm. Edward, though outwardly obedient, plotted in silence. He trusted only a handful of loyal knights, William Montague among them, and swore them to secrecy. On the night of October 19th, 1330, they crept through a hidden passage that wound beneath the castle walls, guided by servants bribed with promises of pardon. The chronicles tell it like a miracle, torches flaring, doors bursting open, and the young king standing in his night robe, voice unshaking as he declared, "Take this traitor away."
Mortimer's sword was seized before he could draw it. Isabella screamed, begging her son for mercy, clutching Mortimer's robe as soldiers dragged him away. The boy did not answer. His eyes were hard, no longer a child's. The next morning, Mortimer's authority was erased from every document. Within weeks, he was tried for treason before a council of peers and sentenced to death. No torture this time, only the gallows. On November 29th, at Tyburn, the man who had ruled England as regent was hanged like a common thief. His body swung for 2 days before being cut down. Queen Isabella was spared execution. Instead, Edward sent her into quiet exile at Castle Rising in Norfolk, where she lived surrounded by servants and memories. England had a king again, truly this time. But Edward's face, even in victory, seemed touched by melancholy. Chroniclers wrote that he looked not as one triumphant, but as one haunted. Perhaps he saw in Mortimer's fall the reflection of his own father's fate, or perhaps he understood that justice and vengeance had begun to merge into one. From that moment forward, Edward III ruled alone. He restored the royal treasury, rebuilt alliances, and reasserted England's strength on the continent. The boy who had learned from shadows now stepped fully into the light, yet he carried those shadows with him always. The camera lingers on Edward's face as dawn breaks through the tower windows of Nottingham Castle, young, regal, but forever marked by the ghosts that raised him. Fade to black. After Mortimer's body swung lifeless at Tyburn, England exhaled, but the air was thick with fear. The young king, barely 18, had just overthrown the most powerful man in the realm. Now the question was whether he could hold what he had taken. The court of Edward III was a theater of reckoning. Within weeks, letters sealed with the royal crest spread across the kingdom, summonses, accusations, and quiet commands. Dozens of knights, courtiers, and clergy who had once knelt before Mortimer now faced inquiry. Some were stripped of lands, others vanished without trial. The message was unmistakable. The age of regents was over. Edward had no taste for the spectacle of torture that had marked his father's time. His justice was cleaner, swifter, colder. But beneath that restraint lay an iron resolve. He demanded loyalty not from fear, but from memory. The council chamber at Westminster echoed with the sound of wax seals breaking and oaths being sworn anew. Chroniclers record a moment when Edward paused before Mortimer's confiscated seal of office, once the symbol of unchecked power, and said quietly, "A kingdom must have one voice, or it has none." He appointed new men to old offices, loyalists from the marches, veterans of his grandfather's wars, young minds untainted by court intrigue. Among them rose William Montague, now his closest confidant, a man whose sword had helped him free at Nottingham. Montague became the architect of Edward's early reign, reshaping England's politics around discipline, merit, and trust. But the ghosts of the dispensers still haunted the realm. Many who had profited under Hugh's tyranny had also served Mortimer, changing sides as easily as robes. Edward ordered a full audit of royal grants made during his mother's regency. Lands seized from dispenser loyalists were reconsidered, titles questioned, marriages annulled if they smelled of corruption. The machinery of power turned slowly but relentlessly, grinding down everything unstable. In the spring of 1331, a curious scene unfolded. A squire named Thomas Wake, once an aide to Mortimer, was brought before the king. Expecting torture or death, he fell to his knees, confessing his treason and begging for mercy. Edward's response was chilling in its calm. England had enough of blood. Go home and remember what loyalty costs. The court murmured. Some called it mercy, others calculation. Edward was not forgiving, he was remembering. Every spared man was now bound to him by gratitude and fear alike. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella lived in gilded confinement at Castle Rising. Edward sent her generous allowances, but forbade her any role in government. Chroniclers say she wrote letters filled with longing and regret, addressed not to her son, but to the memory of Mortimer. Edward never replied. To him, sentiment was the enemy of rule. Beyond the palace walls, England began to heal. Roads long abandoned to bandits were repaired. Royal messengers carried new decrees across the shires. Trade with Flanders revived. The exchequer began to swell. A sense of order, stern, disciplined, purposeful, returned to a realm weary of chaos. Yet Edward's new court was not without shadows. His methods, though efficient, bred unease. The nobles admired his strength, but whispered that he had inherited both his father's passion and his mother's pride. A lion raised among serpents, one bishop called him, and perhaps not yet free of their venom. But Edward ignored such whispers. He knew England needed not tenderness, but clarity. The crown must be feared again, not for its cruelty, but for its certainty. The scene fades on Westminster Hall, sunlight cutting through dust as clerks seal new decrees with fresh wax, the rhythm of restoration, measured and absolute. The cleansing of the court was not the end of vengeance, it was its refinement. Fade to black.
By 1332, the realm had begun to breathe again. England's young monarch, once the trembling boy beneath Mortimer's shadow, now commanded with precision. Yet Edward knew that power without law was merely another form of tyranny. He had witnessed that lesson carved into flesh, in the dismembered body of Hugh Despenser, in the quiet tears of his father's downfall, in his mother's cold ambition. Those memories did not fade. They hardened into principle. He summoned his council at Westminster and spoke words that would echo through centuries. Let there be law so strong that even a king must kneel before it. This was not humility, it was design. Edward understood that the monarchy's survival depended on the people's belief in its justice. He began reforming the structure of royal courts, ensuring that judges answered directly to the crown rather than to local lords. Bribery and favoritism, once the currency of governance, became crimes punished by confiscation and exile. In those years, new legal writs emerged, precursors of the system that would one day define English common law. Disputes were recorded in written rolls, trials by ordeal were phased out, and the royal seal, once a tool of personal power, became a symbol of impartial authority. Chroniclers noted with awe that Edward's court spoke more of order than of favor, and of judgment more than revenge. But justice in the 14th century was not mercy, it was performance. Public punishment remained an essential theater of control, and though Edward never repeated the grotesque execution of Hugh Despenser, he did not erase its memory either. When traitors were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the ritual followed a formula perfected during his youth. The body became a warning. The voice of the state spoke through the silence of mutilation. In private, however, Edward despised spectacle. He sought to replace fear with reverence, tyranny with discipline. His decrees on treason were carefully worded, narrowing its definition so that mere speech could not condemn a man. Yet beneath this order lay a paradox. To secure peace, he had to preserve the machinery of terror. The king's counselors debated late into the night over parchment and wine. Should rebellion be met with the rope or with reason? Edward listened, said little, and in the end decided both. He believed a kingdom could not survive without law, but law itself could not survive without consequence. It was during these reforms that he began drafting the ordinances that would later shape England's foreign wars: taxation, conscription, and claims to legitimacy. To rule justly at home, he must also rule boldly abroad. The legacy of his father's weakness would be erased not through cruelty, but through triumph. And so, from the ashes of treason, Edward built a new architecture of governance, stone upon stone, law upon law. Chroniclers described him as a king forged by suffering and made wise by loss. His reforms outlived him by centuries. They laid the foundations of a monarchy bound by justice, yet commanding by right, a delicate balance between authority and restraint that England would wrestle with for generations. But behind the parchment and proclamations, the human story remained. Each decree he signed was a silent conversation with the dead, each law a confession to the ghosts that once haunted his dreams. When courtiers congratulated him on restoring order, Edward merely replied, "Order is only the memory of fear, arranged neatly." The camera drifts across parchment scrolls, stacked in candlelight, wax seals gleaming like drops of blood. The narrator's voice lowers. The law was his redemption and his weapon. Fade to black. After Roger Mortimer's execution, Queen Isabella was spared. Edward III, now king in both name and truth, showed her a mercy the age seldom granted. Yet mercy, for Isabella, became another form of punishment. She was not imprisoned in chains or dungeons, but confined within Castle Rising, a sprawling estate surrounded by moors and mist, where silence was thicker than stone. There, far from the court she once ruled through fear and cunning, Isabella lived the rest of her days in a gilded exile. To the outside world, she was treated with the respect befitting a queen mother. Her servants called her Madame Leroyne, and she received a generous allowance from the royal treasury. But behind the high walls, whispers told another story. The woman who had orchestrated a king's fall and a lover's rule now wandered the halls, speaking to ghosts that no one else could see. She was said to waken the night screaming Mortimer's name, clawing at her throat as if feeling the rope that had strangled him. At times, she would order the servants to set an extra plate at dinner for the king, her true husband, who she claimed would soon return from his journey through fire. Chroniclers of the time described her condition with fascination and unease. Some said she had gone mad from guilt. Others whispered that she practiced necromancy, trying to commune with the spirits of Edward II and Mortimer through mirrors and candle smoke. A few even claimed to see flickers of blue flame dancing around her chamber windows at night. But perhaps the truth was simpler. Isolation had consumed her. For a woman who had once commanded armies and toppled a monarchy, the stillness of Castle Rising was unbearable. The same intellect that once manipulated kings now turned inward, feeding on memory. Each corridor echoed not with footsteps, but with what had been lost. She spent hours in the chapel, kneeling before the altar until her knees bled, whispering prayers that blurred into confessions. Records from the household accounts mention an unusual purchase: dozens of candles ordered monthly, far more than any household her size required. Those who served her believed she kept them burning through the night, terrified of what might come with darkness. As years passed, her beauty faded, but her presence did not. Visitors wrote that her gaze could still freeze a room, that her smile carried something dangerous, half sorrow, half pride. She spoke rarely of Mortimer or her son, but when she did, her words were measured like scripture. "Power," she once said to her confessor, "is a flame. We think it warms us, but it only burns what we love." By the late 1340s, when plague swept across England, Isabella's isolation deepened.
Many believed she saw the pestilence as divine judgment. She gave away much of her wealth to churches and hospitals, insisting that coin cannot ransom the soul. Her final years were spent mostly in her chambers, surrounded by relics of her past, the jeweled rosary of her youth, a faded portrait of Edward II, and a ring said to have belonged to Mortimer. She would turn it in her hands for hours, as if waiting for it to speak. In August 1358, on a storm-swept night, Isabella of France died quietly in her bed. The chronicles record no last words, only that she was found with a silver crucifix clutched in one hand and Mortimer's ring in the other. She was buried at the Franciscan Church in London. Legend says she requested that her husband's heart, preserved in a silver casket after his death, be placed upon her chest. Whether this was true or a later invention, the symbolism endures. For all her cunning and cruelty, Isabella's end was strangely human, a life consumed by love, ambition, and remorse. To history, she remains the she-wolf of France, a woman whose hunger for power devoured kings. But to the centuries that followed, her story became something more complex, a meditation on how vengeance, even when victorious, leaves nothing untouched. The camera drifts over Castle Rising's cold stones. A single candle flickers beside an empty chair. The narrator's voice returns, low and reflective. The wolf's howl fades. Only echoes remain. Fade to silence.
The scaffold at Hereford may have collapsed long ago, the ashes of its fires scattered by the wind. But the shadow of that day in November 1326 still lingers over English history. For those who witnessed Hugh Despenser's end, it was not merely a spectacle of vengeance. It was the purging of a decade of fear. A kingdom that had been silenced by terror now roared with unrestrained fury. Yet as the crowds cheered, and as Despenser's mutilated body was displayed as a warning to others, another truth began to take root, one that history has never fully erased. Because in destroying the tyrant, England revealed something darker about itself. The people who once trembled beneath his cruelty now took part in his torture with wild joy. The nobles who condemned his corruption had once enabled it through their silence. And the queen who demanded his death would, within a few years, fall into the same trap of greed and ambition that had doomed her victim. When the flames died down, justice and vengeance had become indistinguishable. Edward II, humiliated and abandoned, was soon imprisoned and quietly murdered. His screams, if they came, swallowed by the same darkness that had once shielded Despenser's crimes. Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, ruled England as regents, but the very forces they had unleashed would soon consume them too. In 1330, a teenage King Edward III rose against them. Mortimer was executed for treason, and Isabella was forced into exile, a poetic echo of the chaos she had once set loose. Hugh Despenser's fall had not restored peace. It had simply shifted the burden of guilt from one set of hands to another. But history rarely deals in moral satisfaction. It deals in memory, and memory is cruel. Despenser's execution became a template of state-sanctioned terror, the model for the hanged, drawn, and quartered punishment that would echo through centuries of English law. His name, once cursed, became a silent reminder of how power and proximity to the throne could turn loyalty into a death sentence. And yet, buried beneath the horror of his death lies the true lesson of his life. That tyranny does not begin with blades or chains. It begins with whispers, with flattery, with unchecked privilege, with the slow corrosion of accountability.
Dispenser's England was a mirror of every age that forgets this truth. When power becomes personal, when law bends to the will of one man, justice becomes theater, and the stage always ends in blood. Perhaps that is why his story still haunts us, because it is not only the tale of one man's ambition, it is the anatomy of corruption itself, played out upon the human body. As centuries passed, chroniclers wrote his name with loathing, but also fascination. For in the brutal elegance of his execution, they saw a reflection of their own world, a warning that civilization is only a thin veneer over savagery. So when we look back on that cold November day, we must ask not just what Hugh Despenser deserved, but what his death revealed about us.